You're listening to Sweet Talk, all things maple. Welcome to Sweet Talk, all things maple. I'm Adam Wild, co-director of the Cornell Maple Program. And joining me is my colleague and co-host, Aaron Whiteman. Hi, Aaron.
Hi, Adam. It's great to be back on Sweet Talk. It's been a while since we recorded an episode of Sweet Talk, and I miss being in the studio. We had a good run, but our funding evaporated.
That's great. Those are some nice puns, Aaron. Yes, the project has been funded through a couple different sources, and we reached the end of a funding cycle. But we tapped into a new source of funding and plan to get back into a routine of new episodes. And for our listeners who do not know, the Cornell Maple Program is not funded through the university. We're actually instead funded primarily through grants and selling maple syrup that we produce.
Yeah, funding for maple research and education is important for providing support to the maple industry, such as this podcast. And we're grateful to the New York State Maple Producers Association for providing the funding support to get Sweet Talk back on the air. So Adam, what have you been up to during our pause from Sweet Talk?
Well, my wife and I had a baby, so that's really changed things in my life. But it's been mostly fun, and I was able to get the little guy out in the sugar bush this spring. But at the sugar house, we had a relatively productive maple season. One thing I have been working on in the last year was testing methods to chill down maple sap. Stay tuned for a future episode about that work. What about you, Aaron?
Wow, I don't have anything that exciting to report. I've just been working away at a number of projects and spending my spare time working on the farm. One thing that has been on my to-do list is answering the questions we've received from listeners through email and the website. That's why it seems appropriate to kick off a new season of Sweet Talk by reaching into the mailbag and answering some of your questions on the air.
Sounds great, Aaron. Here's our first question from a listener. Hi, I'm about to start making maple syrup again for the first time in many years on a property quite close to Cornell. Can you tell me when the sugaring season is these days? Many years ago, it used to be late February or even early March, but now I'm seeing temperatures in the forecast that seem almost ideal. I imagine climate change has made a big effect. Am I right that it is now much earlier? Thanks. What do you think, Aaron?
Well, we should note for our listeners that we received this question in late December. So when they said they're seeing ideal temperatures in late December, that's pretty early compared to the historic trend. And that's a really astute observation from this listener because the maple season has changed. If you look at the data, the maple season has shifted about 1 day earlier every decade, going back as long as we've recorded when sap runs are happening. So the maple season is generally earlier. But as we all know, it can be highly variable. So it's really hard to guess how any particular maple season will turn out. But odds are, based on the data, if you tap a little earlier now, you'll probably get more syrup in the average year. Would you agree with that, Adam?
Yeah, I would agree. And as you said, everything is variable. Right after this listener sent this email in late December, it got cold and stayed cold for a while this past year. So every year is different. But generally, getting your taps in sooner than later is usually better, I think we find at this point. But with that, it's really important to think about tap hole sanitation. So making sure that we're using new spouts and our tubing is not all that old or dirty so that if we have those spouts into the trees for a while and it doesn't flow or we get some slight warm-ups that isn't really flowing, the tap hole is not going to plug up with microbes as easily or as quickly so that you have good flowing tap holes for a longer period of time.
Yep, tap hole sanitation is really critical. What about options like retapping or reaming or bumping? So basically drilling the tap hole deeper. Have you had any success with those methods, Adam, to extend the season?
I've played with that a little bit. It depends on the year. I don't think every year is necessary to go in and retap. I haven't done any of the reaming where we go in with a bigger drill bit or a bumping to look at does that increase production, but I have done the retapping and it does increase production, but it doesn't always pay off with the amount of time and maybe added materials that are going in and retapping, but it depends on the year. And I find up in where I'm located in Northern New York, our seasons aren't usually dragged out for as long of a period. And it doesn't get quite as warm as it may down where you're located, Aaron, at the Arnott Forest, where that may pay off. And I think you've done a little bit of work and just did some of that this year, right?
Yeah, we've had mixed results because when you reach a point where your tap holes are no longer productive, but you think there might be more sap to be had, like the season's going to go on for a while yet, you're really guessing, right? You don't know what's really going to happen. So sometimes we've gone out and we've retapped And we've had a good run of weather and gotten significant amount of additional sap. And other years, it just warmed up right away and we didn't get much more yield for all that work. And there's also the issue of creating another hole in the tree. So you're creating additional wounding to the tree. So it's something that if it was done on a regular basis year after year, that could add up to a significant amount of additional wounding to the tree. And it's unclear whether that's really sustainable or worth it. So on the whole, it seems like retapping might be something that works once in a while in an emergency. Like if you haven't made enough syrup to meet your quota and it looks like it'll be just right that year for a retap. But in general, it's not something that seems worthwhile.
Yeah, it's a kind of on the fly decision. I think it also depends on how quickly your trees can respond and grow if you're creating a new hole or creating more wounding in that tree. And if your trees grow quickly, then it might be more worth it to do it.
Yeah, so long story short, to answer this question, it is appropriate to tap a little earlier, but every year is variable. So you never know how it's going to turn out. That's what makes it exciting. So our next question comes from Fran Keem, and he asks, during February of 2025, there were some preliminary reports out there that were indicating that this year was shaping up to be a good maple harvest year. However, when the season actually got started, we were faced with sap that had very low sugar content of less than 1%, resulting in dark syrup and difficulty filtering syrup. These conditions improved a little after a couple of weeks, but not to an optimally satisfactory level. I collected a lot of sap, but my overall production was down by almost 20%, and I did not make any light syrup. What is your take on this phenomena? Do you have any ideas of what caused this? Is it something you can predict in the future? Thank you. So that's the question from Fran. What do you think, Adam? There's a lot in that question.
Yeah, there's a lot to unwrap there. I mean, talking first about the sap sugar, the sap sweetness, I think now that we have reverse osmosis in the industry, a lot of people think that, sap sweetness isn't all that important anymore as it used to be back when we were boiling raw sap without reverse osmosis. But I think it's when we get these years of really low sugar that we start to realize like, actually having more sugar in the sap does help yield more syrup overall, right? Because it is frustrating when you have these years of low sugar and you just yield a lot less syrup. And I experienced this up at our forest the past 2 years. And I think many producers across the industry have the last couple of years. It was kind of hit and miss this year. Not everybody had low sugar, but many producers did this year as well. And so there's a lot of factors that go into sap sweetness. There's not usually one individual thing that we can point to say that's why we had low sap sugar. And what's, I think, important to look back, that I like to think about now, is that when we look back, why do we have low sap sugar? I think we used to always think that, well, it depended on how was the growing season last year. Did the trees produce a lot of sugars during the previous growing season? But there was some work done out of Quebec where they actually looked at the carbon isotopes within maple syrup to date those to when those were produced and found that oftentimes they come from the past 3 to 5 years. And so knowing that now, we can say the sap sweetness that we collect really depends on what has happened in the past 3 or 5 years. So it makes it even harder to point at one individual point. Is that what you kind of would agree with, Aaron?
Yeah, tree physiology is complex, and the ecosystems they live in and respond to are complex with a lot of different variables. And as you mentioned, we're looking at a multi-year response to those variables. So if we think about some things that have happened, we know that the climate is warming. There have been wildfires that have cast like a significant pall of smoke over the region during the growing season. There have been droughts. So there are a lot of factors that could have contributed to this. And I think the thing we need to look out for is a long-term trend over time. If we start seeing low sap sugar content year after year after year, then we know we have a problem and we can hone in on it. And it might be something that we can counteract to some degree, but largely it's hard to imagine how there could be anything we could do about sap sugar content. We can't irrigate the woods in a reasonable way. That wouldn't be economical. We don't fertilize. So the thing we're left with is forest management, right? So if we start seeing a trend of lower sap sugar content over time, the best thing we can probably do is just respond by trying to make our trees as healthy as possible with some active forest management.
Yeah, that is definitely very true. Making sure we have healthy trees and we're good producers, that we can collect, and optimize the most amount of sap from those trees as we can through our sap collection system. So one thing that I have a theory, again, this isn't 100% proven, but one theory, and again, it's one factor of the many factors of why maybe sap sugar is low, is that I think we've been having some warmer fall time weather, kind of once the leaves have dropped, that it's staying warm through November and December, and that anytime it's above freezing, the tree it's still alive, it's active, it's going to be respiring, and to do that, it's going to burn up some sugars. And so it makes me wonder if they're using up some of the sugars through respiration, or if they're just aren't converting as much starch into sucrose during that time period. So lots of different factors. And unfortunately, right now, we don't have an ability to really predict how the season might be next year or the year after, because there's so many different variables. We are working on collecting data through our Cornell Maple Climate Network, where we're collecting this data from different locations. We had 7 different maple locations throughout the maple industry this past season that we're collecting data, and you can actually view that data in real time at cornellsaprun.com. So through that data over time, we hope to have some answers in the future, but it takes time, and I'm not sure we'll ever really truly be able to fully predict nature, right? It's nature, it does what it wants to.
That's right. The Climate Network is a good start. I like your hypothesis, Adam, about metabolism occurring during the dormant season. If you look at our climate sensor data, you'll see that the ground at the Arnott Forest, for instance, didn't freeze until late January. And a lot of the biomass of a tree is actually underground. So there could be activity, respiration happening underground that burns up those sugars. So it'll be interesting to see what we learn over time with that.
Yeah, I think the answer, the other question Fran had was about filtering, right? And I know a lot of folks had issues filtering, myself included, this past maple season. And that's something that changes every year and throughout the season as well. It might be fine for a week or two, and then it gets filters really hard and then comes back. And that usually has to do with the various mineral loads and microbial loads that are within the ground, within the sap that the trees are taking up. And I would say there's a lot we still don't know about in this area of why filtering is harder at different times always. Do you have any insight into filtering, Aaron?
Well, I think it might have to do with the 4 M's. Microbes and minerals make a mess, right? So we're always trying to clean up microbes and minerals from our syrup. That's what we filter out. And those things can be variable. There's more microbes when it's hot because they reproduce faster. And we're not really sure what can lead to higher mineral loads. So it seems like maybe we had some combination of those things happening this season.
Yeah, I would agree, Aaron. So our next question comes from listener Ken, who asked, there's a question that has always concerned me and wondering if the experts could weigh in. As sap is concentrated into syrup, is there the possibility that contaminants, pollutants also get concentrated in the final product? The pollutants I'm concerned about specifically are things like fertilizers, pesticide, PFAS, etc. Are they in the sap to start with, and then are they concentrated in the syrup? I collect/crowdsource sap from approximately 60-year-old suburban neighborhood. I cannot be sure what chemicals have been applied or accumulated in the soil in that time. What do you think? Can pollutants end up being concentrated in syrup? Thanks. What do you think, Aaron?
Wow, yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's one that a lot of people have. But unfortunately, it's an area where not a lot of research has been done. So there's not really an answer to this right now. And I will just add that it's not just suburban neighborhoods and places like that where this could be an issue. For example, there's been a lot of sewage sludge that's been spread on agricultural fields in more rural locations, and it's been found that that sewer sludge is loaded with PFAS. So this could be an issue for sugar bushes that are not anywhere near a city where you wouldn't expect there to be chemical contaminants in the sap. So it's something we really need to learn about, but that research hasn't been completed yet.
Yeah, we do know that trees do accumulate chemicals, though. There has been various studies on things not, necessarily related to maple syrup, but just trees in general. They do accumulate chemicals, but we don't actually know if that's passed on in the maple sap, and if so, what form is it within? Sometimes chemicals change their form within the tree, but if it is within that sap, it certainly could concentrate. It's most likely not going to be cooked off, especially if it's some kind of heavy metal. Another area that I think people have been concerned about is in cemeteries with like embalming chemicals and things like that over time. And we do know that maples are what they call hydraulic lifters. Well, they'll actually pull water and minerals from deeper down in the soil and release near the surface of the soil for fine roots to take up and other plants and things like that. So we do know there are some researchers who are working on it, though. So hopefully we'll have more answers in the future.
Yeah, it's great that research is now finally getting underway at a few institutions, and I think more people will be looking at this in the near future. But for now, I would say if you're concerned about a particular area, it's best to avoid it because remember, folks, we're making food here and there's really not any margin for error. So if you make a food and it's got toxins in it, that's just not acceptable. So if you're concerned, just avoid those areas. So our next question says, "Hi Cornell Maple Team. I'm interested in purchasing bulk maple syrup from a sugar maker, then repackaging it and putting it into my own brand's containers. Is there a good source for rules around this? Is there anything I should know about labeling it? Do I need to put the original producer's information on the containers or just my information? Also curious about the rules in New York regarding selling and shipping maple products through online sales. Do I need a special business license for this?" So that's an interesting question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's one that's maybe overlooked within the maple industry a little bit. And in New York, and I believe in a lot of states, if you do produce it, you do not need to have a certified kitchen if you are the one producing. But if you're buying in syrup, you do have to bottle that in a certified kitchen.
That's right. So maple syrup is an unusual product in that it's exempt in some cases from food safety laws and registrations for commercial kitchens. Most foods where you're manufacturing them are required to have some type of license and oversight because, for obvious reasons, because how that food is made can determine how safe it is. Maple syrup, if you make it on your own farm from your own sap, is exempt because it's considered a low hazard food because there aren't a lot of places in that process where hazards can be introduced. However, that exemption states that you must follow good manufacturing practices. So you're supposed to be doing everything the correct and safe way. There's just no regulatory oversight over that. But the issue becomes when you're buying someone else's syrup and you don't know what happened in their production system and the original producer's name isn't on the bottle, it's hard to track where an issue might have come from. So if you're buying someone else's syrup and repackaging it, you have to do it in a commercial kitchen. But you do not have to put the original producer's name on the bottle. You put your name on the bottle. You say packaged by, and you give your full name and address. That's because the person putting it in the bottle is who they're going to come to if there's an issue with the syrup.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Aaron. That's spot on. And to follow up with some sources for information, reaching out to your state agriculture and markets agency or equivalent within certain states. They usually have a lot of information right on their website. And you'd also want to focus on packaged food and food labeling to make sure that the labeling for that product is correct. And for most states, you don't need a special license for selling and shipping maple syrup online as long as you are following the state's kind of food packaging and labeling requirements. Moving on to our next question, this listener writes, "Hi, we bought a rubber maple mold last fall from a guy. It's a bit dirty and cruddy. I'm wondering if there's a way to clean this mold up without ruining the mold or instilling an off flavor. Any help would be greatly appreciated. Thank you." So Aaron, what's your recommendation for cleaning like an older rubber maple candy shaped mold?
Yeah, this is a common issue because these molds, a lot of them have been around for a while. And people have been making maple candy for a long time. And quite often they end up sitting in a container or a drawer for a long period of time, and then they get picked up and used again. Sometimes they're sold secondhand, and they can really absorb off flavors. They can get moldy, but fortunately they're made from silicone, which is pretty resilient as a material. And you can clean these in a number of different ways. The method I always resort to as a first attempt is to just boil it in hot water. So the boiling water, if you boil it for a little while, we usually lift all the stray material off. And then if there's still an odor embedded in it, you can try baking soda. But really, again, we're making food here. So it's really important that we not cut any corners. And if you detect any off odors after trying to clean up the mold, it's best to just throw it out and get a new mold. Compared to the cost of maple candy, molds are relatively cheap. So it's just not worth it to make off-flavored candy to save a few bucks on the mold.
Yeah, I would agree. I have some old rubber molds here that I made some candy in, and they just gave this like rubber tire kind of smell or flavor. And I had other people said, oh, they wasn't ones I was selling, but some people said, oh, I can't taste it. But I know it was there. I could tell. And it's not worth it, especially all the work you put into making maple candy. You don't want that flavor in there.
Absolutely. Maple candy should always be top flavor. That's what people pay for. So our next question says, I make a fair amount of maple sugar and was considering purchasing a power sieve for sifting it. Was wondering if anyone in this group had any suggestions of size mesh to use in that. So that's a great question. It's a question that's come up a few other times from other listeners. And there's an interesting answer to it because the sugar industry is a really big industry. And when you buy a bag of sugar at the grocery store, you may notice that it looks very uniform. And that's because they're sifting it by size. So there are actually size classes for each type of sugar. And granulated sugar, which is what most maple producers are making, in the sugar industry, they classify that as sugar with crystal sizes between 250 to 500 microns. And so you would need 2 sieves to sieve your maple sugar to that size, right? One for sifting out the larger crystals and one to let the crystals smaller than that size range fall through. So usually those are sieves that are sized 60 to 35. And that's how they're designated on the Taylor scale that dictates sieve size. But you could also look at the micron size for the openings in the mesh and just look for a sieve that's 250 microns or thereabout and one that's 500 microns. How's that for a specific answer?
That's a great answer, Aaron. I'll just add that it's really important to make sure that whatever you're using is food grade, the plastic or stainless steel. Don't use something that's been used for something that was non-food grade previously. And I think you've actually done quite a bit of work on looking at different size particles of maple sugar and that there's various uses for different sizes, right? So it can be helpful to sieve out maple sugar.
Yeah, you might actually want to invest in a series of sieves to create a bunch of different size classes and save those larger chunks to package up as coffee nibs or something like that. And the finer stuff can be used in place of like a confectioner's sugar, perhaps. So there's definitely an opportunity to create more value from your sugar by sieving it.
Great point, Aaron. Our next question comes from a listener who states that I have land in Alaska with lots of birch trees. Is there a way to safely bottle permeate and sap? And that's birch sap. I like the research you do. It has been extremely helpful to making birch syrup. Thank you. That's a great question because we actually recently just published a couple different documents referring to creating a shelf-stable maple sap and doing that on kind of a small scale with equipment that you have within your sugar house most likely. But we also did some work looking at kind of alternative tree saps to create bottled sap beverages. And one was looking at birch along with beech sap and some aspen sap actually as well. And so we do have some new information out there, right, Aaron?
Yeah, we have a fact sheet published on our website, cornellmaple.com, that goes through the steps to acidify and hot pack sap. The key thing here, though, is that when you acidify a sap, it does change the flavor. And there are multiple food grade acids that can be used for the acidification. And the trick is finding the acid that matches the flavor profile you're trying to create, whether that's more neutral or whether you're trying to add a little bit of tartness to the sap. So you could look at citric acid, malic acid, lactic acid, phosphoric acid. So there are multiple different acids that are available out there. If you use something like citric acid, you'll have more of a lemony taste. Malic acid has a little hint of sour apples, so it's worth playing with it to see which one gives you the best flavor profile.
Yeah, and actually with the work with the birch sap, we looked at some of the different acids that are within there naturally to see what would kind of complement with that. And some of it's going to be a personal preference of what do you want that final flavor to be. And it's, I think, great to think about bottling birch sap when you have this product that has fairly low sugar. My birch trees this year had an average of 0.6% sugar across the season. So it takes a lot of sap, like 120, 140 parts of sap to make 1 part of syrup. So it's a lot of sap to make a tiny bit of syrup. But if we can bottle that and sell that as a sap beverage, we can make a lot more product with a lot less work overall.
Yeah, if you pencil it out, there's certainly the potential to make a lot more money by selling sap to consumers than there is by selling syrup. But it is a more complicated process, and you have to move a lot of volume to make that money. But there certainly is the opportunity there. This listener also asked about permeate. What are your thoughts on that, Adam?
So permeate being the purified water from the reverse osmosis. There's ability to do that. Our work did not look into that too much, but there's still regulations behind, bottling permeate. And that's not just putting water in a bottle and capping it. That water needs to have a pasteurization type of method in order to do that. And I guess for both the bottled water and bottled sap, I will say that when we go back to our question we had earlier about, and you stated, Aaron, that maple and some of these tree syrups have exemptions from needing certified kitchens if you're the one producing it. But when it comes to bottling sap, you definitely have to have a certified kitchen. And here in New York, you have to actually go through an acidified food processing course as well.
Yeah, there's lots of additional regulatory barriers to doing this. Another step you would go through is getting a scheduled process approval. So taking your method of bottling to a process authority who's a food science expert that's registered with the US government as a process authority, and having them review the process to make sure that it's safe and shelf stable. And these people are really helpful. They're not regulators. They're there to help you make sure your process is adequate. So if there are problems with it, they would make recommendations for how to change it. But even though there are those barriers, this is definitely something worth looking into if you're at all interested. And they're not insurmountable. Meeting the regulatory requirements isn't insurmountable, but it does require some investment, potentially in equipment. You have to have access to a commercial kitchen. So there are some real barriers there.
Yeah, there definitely are, but I think it is reachable. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we tried to focus our fact sheet document on making sure that it's not a lot of new equipment. So using the canner or bottler that you already have in your sugar house that can be implemented. So it's not huge barriers.
Our next question is on the subject of glucose meters for invert sugar testing. And the question says, hello, thank you all so much for the incredible wealth of information on maple confections. I'm a passionate sugarer and confection novice. After many batches of bad sugar attempts, I finally read from you that I need to test for invert levels. I purchased a True Metrics unit that Walgreens puts their name on, but also states that it's made by Trividia Health. When I test my diluted syrup as you recommend, the device shows an error that represents invalid hemostat. My question is, am I using a different type of glucose meter? Are they different by brand? And only certain meters will understand syrup diluted by 10%? If there's any help you can offer, I would be really grateful. Thank you for taking the time. So yeah, this is a tricky bit of business because testing the invert sugar levels in your syrup is really key to making good confections. And what that means, if you're unfamiliar with the concept of invert sugars, is that maple trees put out one type of sugar, and that's sucrose. But that sucrose can get broken down by microbes that are in your sap collection system into fructose and glucose. And those are what we call invert sugars. And those different types of sugars behave differently during the crystallization process. So if you have too much invert sugar, too much fructose and glucose mixed in with your sucrose, the crystal sizes don't match and your sugar won't crystallize. So it's really important to test those levels beforehand so you can make a good quality sugar. And the method that's been developed for testing these quickly utilizes a glucose meter that's meant for diabetics to test their blood. Have you done that process, Adam?
I'm less experienced and do it less than you because I don't do as much with confections as you do down at the Arnott Forest, Aaron. But I do know that our predecessor, Steve Childs, really worked a lot with this and tested different glucose blood sugar meters and found that some did not work as well. Some did not give an accurate reading, right? And that's probably what this listener is finding, is that this particular meter doesn't really work that great. And the one that Steve Childs had found that worked the best was the AccuCheck Aviva, right?
Right. So in the process of developing this protocol for testing invert sugars, a lot of different glucose meters were tested. Some worked, some didn't. The AccuCheck Aviva was identified as one that worked really well. And the basic method, if you're curious, is illustrated on our YouTube channel. Just go to Cornell Maple Program YouTube channel, and there's a video showing how to test the invert sugar with the meter. But the problem is they keep discontinuing these meters and issuing new ones. And a lot of the new meters don't work as well. So the AccuCheck Aviva has been discontinued. If you can find a used one, they still work great. They still sell the test strips for it. But if you can't find one, we haven't really identified the next model that works really well. There's a new one called the Aviva Guide Me from AccuCheck, but it seemed like it was giving inaccurate answers to us. So we're not sure it really works. We need to do more tests on that. So the bottom line is, if you can find one of those AccuCheck Avivas, that would work really great. And if you can't, it might be difficult right now to find something that works. And I think one thing we really need in the maple industry is for one of these equipment suppliers to come out with a designated glucose meter for maple producers.
If anybody has any tips or recommendations on what might work well, certainly reach out to us. I know there are color test strips, but they can be a little bit kind of subjective in a way in how those are interpretive. So they're not perfect either, unfortunately.
Yeah, we really need something that has a higher level of precision that gives us an answer that's really precise to the 0.1% of inverts for it to be useful.
Here's another question asking about the average price of bulk syrup. In determining the average price of bulk syrup for sap buying purposes, exactly what grade of bulk syrup are averaged to find the average price? That's a great question. If you're buying sap from somebody, usually want to base that on the bulk price for syrup, and bulk price can change whether it's golden syrup or amber, dark, very dark syrup. Those prices can be different. So what do you recommend as, the best way to average out that price?
Yeah, this is an interesting question because these types of arrangements tend to be highly variable. They're made between individuals. Sometimes they're handshake agreements. Sometimes they're formal contracts. But what they have to anticipate in either case is what grades of syrup are going to be made from the sap before they really know. And so because they buy the sap and then they process it, and they find out what grade it is. And it's getting all mixed in with other sap sometimes. So it's really hard to tell. So the best method that most people rely on is just looking back historically at what proportions of golden, amber, dark, and very dark they've made in the past from their sap, and kind of applying those proportions to the price and averaging it out to some average price that's kind of in the middle. It's not going to be super precise, but that's usually the best you can do. You buy sap, Adam.
Yeah, I do buy a little bit of sap, and I don't pay them until the end of the season, and we don't always know what the bulk price of syrup will be for that season until the season's over, and so you can't always predict that ahead of time at the beginning of the season. And so I look more back kind of in hindsight of, did I make mostly amber, mostly dark, golden, very dark that season, and then calculate out that way for the producer and based on the bulk price for that particular year. I will say that we do have on our cornellmaple.com website, we have a sap buying spreadsheet where you can plug this in. And I do for my producers that I'm buying sap from, I'm putting in each day that they're bringing sap, how much sap they brought and how sweet it was to calculate, how much syrup would that make and how much is that sap worth. And you can look back at your data of how much, what type of syrup are you making at that point in the season. A lot of times I do just look at, kind of an average between, and I'm mostly making amber and dark syrup. So I tend to err towards the higher side to help the producer that's bringing the sap to me, since they're actually hauling it, I'm not picking it up. So I do look though at the end of the season, if I do get some sap that's going to be making off flavored, and I base that off of that sap alone, just off of the bulk price for processing grade syrup.
Yeah, so there are a lot of different ways to do it, but it's great when people can work this out because that's a huge opportunity for folks that have maple trees but don't want to invest in the infrastructure to process sap into syrup, or they're building toward that and they don't have that infrastructure yet. It's a great option to just get out there and sell some sap. So it's good that those arrangements can be reached pretty easily. The next question is on the topic of 3/16 tubing, everyone's favorite, right? Remember 3/16 tubing? We all put a bunch of it in the woods and then there were some problems that we've been trying to figure out. So the question is, if I replace my 3/16 inch tubing with 5/16 tubing and leave the same number of 20 taps, what is the downside? And this listener's also planning to install vacuum. And they continue, when replacing 3/16 with 5/16, what is the downside of direct replacement of up to 20 taps on the line instead of 5 taps? Yes, so you've done some of this work, Adam. What did you find in your work?
Yeah, so the biggest thing that we need to think about is now that they're adding vacuum. So when they were on 3/16 before, most likely they were just using gravity and creating some vacuum through the 3/16, a smaller line. And with that, you generally wanted more taps because the more sap in there filled up the lines, so you got better vacuum. Although you don't want to get much above 20. I kind of found that once you got above 20 on good sap runs, sometimes it's too much sap that's filling the lines and it can't all flow out of the tree as well. So the downside when we're thinking about 5/16 switching over and we're putting vacuum on, there's that old saying like strive for 5, no more than 10. And there's people out there now that will say like max of like 3 taps per lateral line when you're on vacuum. And the whole goal is to make sure you have good vacuum at each tree, and that if you put too much sap in that line, it could be blocking some of the vacuum, or to get 20 trees, that lateral line is a long way and you're going to have resistance and drop in vacuum potentially further up the line. But a lot of it, when it comes down to why people are saying less taps, is that it's usually much easier to vacuum leak check when you have less trees on a lateral line. And the other aspect is, if one tree on that line has a leak, if you've got 20 trees and say the first tree has a vacuum leak in it because there's, tap next to a cavity in the tree or something like that, it's going to impact all the other 19 trees on that line. Whereas if there was only, 4 other trees, there's only 4 trees being impacted instead of 19. So that's another reason. But I think it really depends on the slope as well, and how much time you spend out in your woods looking for vacuum leaks, checking, getting things fixed. If that's impacting 19 trees, but it's only for a short amount of time and you get it fixed, that's okay. And if you have good slope where the sap can be flowing out of the line, it's not sagging and pulling that sap uphill, I think that's less of an issue.
Yeah, interestingly, the U.S. Forest Service did research on natural vacuum long ago, and they looked at 5/16 lines. And so they put different numbers of tree taps on 5/16 lines to see if they could generate a natural vacuum. And it took almost 90 trees to get full vacuum. So it can be achieved. You can achieve the same effect that you get with 3/16 tubing with 5/16. But the cautionary tale is, like Adam was saying, if you have a whole bunch of taps on one line and you get a leak in it, you lose production from a whole bunch of taps until you get it fixed. And we experienced this at Arnott when 3/16 tubing first came out. We went wild with it. We strung it all over the woods to see how it would work. And some of our lateral lines were really long with lots of taps. And by really long, I mean like 800 to 1,000 feet. And so one day I went out and I noticed that one of those really long lines that went up a really steep hill was leaking. And I hiked and I hiked and I scrambled through the snow. Couldn't find the leak. And finally I found the leak, and it was on the very last tap. So there were 40 taps on that line. The very last one was leaking, and I was losing production from all 40 taps. So really, it's probably wiser to spread your risk and have fewer taps on a lateral line.
I think that's Murphy's Law in maple production, that where there's a vacuum leak, it's always on the very last tree, right? And so if there's only 3 or 5 trees on that lateral, it's a lot easier to walk to it than there is having 20 or 30 trees to get to that last one. It's a lot more walking. And even I find tapping, when you have those really long laterals, they can seem kind of daunting because you can't see the end. When am I going to be done with this line to move on to the next one too? So there is some advantages, but their downside is it's usually more tubing costs, right? You need more main lines. So there's more cost into that.
You forgot the other part of the Murphy's Law is that when you get to that leak and finally find it, you won't have the tool or the fitting that you need to fix it.
That is so true.
So it's better to keep them short.
Keeping on the topics of thinking about tubing and mainline, next question is asking actually about mainline wire support. And the question is, what is the typical size or gauge for supporting a maple sap mainline? I would like to install about 250 to 350 feet of 3/4 inch mainline, and I've read that people use somewhere between 9 gauge and 14 gauge galvanized steel. The 9 gauge is difficult to work with because it's so stiff, but I don't want the wire to break if it is too weak. Some blogs say aluminum is okay, and some say only use smooth high tensile wire. Hope you can help. Yes, this isn't something we talk about too much. I've actually been switching from when we had a lot of 12 or 12.5 gauge wire installed here at the Clyne Forest, and I've found times where we've had really long runs and it breaks, and trying to fix that, especially if it's on relatively newer-ish systems, it's pretty frustrating. So I've actually switched to the 9 gauge wire for most of what I do, and I know it can seem like it's harder to work with, but to me it's worth it. We use the splices, so we're not using the gripples or crimps or the ratchet strainers. We actually use the splices, so it gets really tight and it holds, and takes a little bit more time. We're also doing shorter runs, but I find that it's there and it will hold up hopefully a lot better for the long term. What do you recommend, Aaron?
Yeah, the key is to install your tubing with a support wire that's strong enough for you to be able to put enough tension on it to keep it nice and straight without any sags. And to do that, you really do need high tensile wire. The non-high tensile wire is just not going to have enough strength to withstand that amount of force. But for a 3/4 inch main line, 12.5 gauge high tensile would be perfectly adequate. Just remember when you're working with high tensile wire that it can be dangerous. It has memory in it, so it likes to keep its shape so it can spring back at you if you lose your grip on it. And you could get poked in the eye really bad with this wire. So always wear safety glasses and be prepared to use a little bit of muscle to cut it. You should have something that's adequate for cutting high tensile wire, like a wire tool or some really good wire cutters that are meant for high tensile wire. But high tensile you definitely want to use. And like Adam said, if you start scaling up to inch tubing, or especially if you get into 1.5 or 1.25 tubing, you're really going to want to look at the 9-gauge high tensile wire because it's just so much stronger. You can put a lot more force on it and you'll get nice straight runs with no sags. And that's really essential for getting a good yield.
Yeah, all great points, Aaron. I would agree on this shorter section that the 12.5 gauge would certainly be fine. Definitely not 14 gauge. That's too thin.
Yep, that's right. So switching gears a little bit, we have a question about reverse osmosis. And this listener asked, I run a 2-step RO system. The first goes to 7%, the second takes it to 20%. The concentrate flow meter of the second RO has an orange tint to the glass. The permeate flow meters are clear. This is after a wash and a rinse. The performance of the second machine is less than 50%. Do you have suggestions? Well, that's a really interesting question. It's something that we've encountered before. That mysterious orange or pinkish orange buildup in the flow meters can be kind of worrisome. And you might think, oh, what do I have growing in here? But it's really something less problematic. And what have you found, Adam? You've encountered this before.
Yeah, typically that comes from mineral buildup. Most likely probably manganese. So when you do your soap wash at the end of every day, the soap wash, the alkaline-based soap wash, is helping kill primarily microbes and clean microbes out of your filters, but it's not helping to dissolve the mineral buildup. So we typically want to do an acid wash, and the acid wash, typically like a citric acid or a phosphoric acid base that you can buy from your maple equipment companies, and that actually like dissolves the mineral, so it cleans up your membranes so they're not plugged up with all that mineral. And you usually always want to follow an acid wash with a soap wash. It helps reset the pores within the membranes. So that would be my recommendation to really clean that up. And you might have to do the acid soap wash back and forth a couple times. Between the acid and soap wash, you don't have to have a huge rinse. You can probably only rinse for like 10, 15 minutes, and it'll be enough to switch back into soap wash and then do a really big rinse after that. If their permeate flow meters are clear, that's a good thing. That means that your membranes are actually working because the minerals should not be going through into the purified, the permeate water. It should stay behind in your concentrate. And so that's a good sign that the minerals are not going through and your permeate should stay clean.
That's right. And that also indicates that your membranes are picking up these minerals, which may partially explain why you're getting less performance from the other machine. I mean, part of the reason your performance is less is just that there's more sugar molecules. It's harder to get the pressure to squeeze more water out. But doing an acid wash might help improve your performance somewhat. So that's probably the answer to your question right there.
And it may not be the whole season. You might just have this for a portion of the season. And if you don't clean it up, then you're going to experience that throughout the season. But it's much like within filtering syrup. It again goes back to those microbes and minerals. And they come at different points of the season, depending on temperature and what the groundwater mineral that are being taken into the tree. So it does change. And so just because they experience it for a week or two, it might get better, but you need to do that acid wash to clean it. Sticking on the theme of reverse osmosis, this question is about the membranes on reverse osmosis. And so the listener asks, I enjoyed a video done a few years back by Steve Childs on reverse osmosis machines. Would someone please comment on setting up an RO using two 4-inch by 40-inch membranes? Is it best to plumb the two membranes in parallel or in series? Thank you. That's a great question. We actually get that kind of quite often of people who are building reverse osmosis. So to clarify, when we're talking about parallel versus in series, parallel being that you have coming out of your pressure pump, the maple sap is going into either of the two membranes, right? And so instead of going into one and then into the other, that would be series. So in series, it's going to go into the first one, come out of the first one, and then go into the second one. In parallel, it's going to split and go into one or the other. Correct, Aaron? What's your thought on, do you like going in parallel or in series?
Yeah, so that the question is which performs better, right? But performance can be measured a lot of ways. Is it higher concentration level? Is it more flow through rate? Is it greater time before clogging? And what we find with these homemade ROs is they're actually fundamentally different than the commercial ones in some ways. They don't operate at as high of a pressure, and they don't have recirculator pumps inside the membranes that keep the sap moving to prevent it from clogging the membranes. So for this type of setup, it's really best to keep your membranes in parallel. And if you want to get a higher sap sugar content, then you can just recirculate the sap through the RO multiple times. Because otherwise you just end up with uneven clogging in your membranes, and that turns into a slow pass-through rate that is basically a slower overall processing rate. So if you keep them in parallel, they run for longer and you have better average throughput.
Yeah, I would agree. A lot of the more commercial and larger RO machines for maple use recirculation pumps when they're running in a series, and that helps kind of create some turbidity within the sap so it doesn't plug up within that membrane as much. And your homemade reverse osmosis machines typically don't have that built into it. And so that's why I would agree the parallel seems to be the best.
Yeah, without that recirculator pump creating that turbulence, the sugars just clog up the membranes real quick, so you can't increase the pressure and get better throughput.
One question that people ask about what's the best temperature for sap to run through an RO to kind of maximize efficiency, because typically warmer sap will run through a lot better, right? Do you have some thoughts on that, Aaron?
Yeah, that's something we've wanted to test for a long time. The hotter the sap is, the more kinetic energy is, meaning the more the sugar molecules are moving around and the further they're spread out, which in theory should allow it to go through the RO faster. And that sounds like it's true. That's what data from other industries indicates. But the problem is sap is a perishable product and we're concentrating it, which makes it even more perishable. So if you heat it up in order to process it faster, you're really going to want to cool it down afterward unless it's going straight into the evaporator, which typically it isn't. So while it sounds like a good idea to increase your processing speed by warming up your sap, it's probably a bad idea in terms of quality because you're going to get some sour sap potentially out of the deal.
Yeah, I would agree. It's something that I always caution people kind of against within a way. And if you are thinking about doing it and it's going to go right into the evaporator, probably don't want to get above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Would you agree, Aaron?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Microbes grow at an exponentially faster rate the warmer it gets. And when you're creating that perfect little warm stew of sugars, they're going to proliferate like crazy. So you don't want to get it too hot.
Yeah, and even if you're going right into your evaporator, like how much time is it spending in the RO? And also like how much time is it spending before it gets into the RO between when you're heating it up? So if you're heating up a big batch and then it takes an hour for that to get through the RO, you just want to be careful.
Yeah, there might be some genius way of doing that we haven't thought of yet. And if someone's thought of a good system, then go for it. But typically I would urge a note of caution for that. Now, for our final question, we're going to stick on the topic of reverse osmosis. And this listener says, I am a backyarder trying to get higher concentrations of sugars by reverse osmosis. My 8800 pump and 100 PSI rated membranes stop at about 6.2% sugar. Is there a way to get these to do more? What do you have to do to get the 20 and 30% sugar concentration I hear about? So this is related again to the last question, right? Same issue. It would be great if we could make these little do-it-yourself reverse osmosis machines and smaller ones get 20 to 30% sugar, but there is some additional technology that's required to achieve that. And we talked about that already, and you have a big fancy reverse osmosis machine, Adam. So again, what are the things that are needed to get to that 20% or higher sugar concentration level?
Yeah, I certainly like to concentrate higher. The higher, I think the less time I have to boil saves me efficiency in my boiling. And I guess I like to be on my toes and boiling, make syrup pretty quickly, make sure I don't burn my pans because it's going through quick. But I still get good flavor that way. So I usually concentrate to around 22 to 23% sugar in my concentrate, and that's on one pass through. So I'm able to get that on one pass. But my reverse osmosis machine has 6 membranes. It's bigger. There's many pressure pumps. But the biggest difference is that the pressure pumps, the membranes, and the housing and different plumbing is designed to run at a much higher pressure. So for me to get up to 22 to 23 bricks, I'm usually running around 350 to 400 or even 450 PSI. So with this listener, they have a 100 psi rated membrane. So they're not getting, close to that. So most of these larger ROs that concentrate to 15, 20, 25% or more usually have pressure switches to shut off the machines right around 500 psi. So they're designed to be able to run to that. So there's pressure hoses in on them that they're designed to be able to handle all that pressure that allows them to get higher. And if you want to get to 30% or a little bit higher, you need even better design plumbing and membranes and everything to be able to handle that additional pressure beyond the, more 20, 25%.
Yeah, and I know that might sound disappointing if you're hoping to get a little higher as a backyarder, but something that is important to remember is there's diminishing returns with concentration, right? So if you go from 2% sugar to 4%, you've cut your work in half, right? So half the boiling time. But as you concentrate further and further up, you're not really gaining a whole lot. For instance, if you go up to 10% concentrate, you're cutting the amount of concentrated sap you need to make a gallon of syrup somewhere to around like 8 gallons of concentrate. Then if you go up to 20%, so you're doing a lot more work concentrating, you're down to around 4 gallons of concentrate per gallon of syrup. So the extra amount that you gain gets smaller and smaller the higher you concentrate. And it takes a lot of extra energy. So if you're getting up to 6% to 10%, you're actually doing pretty good. And remember, in the old days, and I've done this for a long time, you'd sit around the fire and boil and boil and boil some more before you finally get some syrup. And if you're going up to 4 to 6% concentrate, you're cutting that time in half or more already. So you're already doing really good. So unfortunately, there's not a way to get any higher, but fortunately, you're already doing pretty good if you get to 6.2% sugar.
Yeah, I would agree. And some of it depends on the starting sugar too, right? So how sweet is your sap starting? If you only have 1.5% sugar sap, it's going to be even harder to get to that higher percentage on these smaller ROs. And as I mentioned with the previous question is, again, these more larger commercial grade reverse osmosis machines have these recirculation pumps that prevent some plugging and clogging within the membranes as well. And that allows them to go a little bit higher by creating kind of this turbulence inside. So that's another aspect to kind of think about why it makes it a little bit harder. But I would agree, if you can get to 6%, that's still, you've done a lot of work, taken out a lot of water already.
Yeah, so that's all we have for questions today. It was great to get back into the swing here. And in future episodes of Sweet Talk, we plan to have some guests and probably do some more Q&A. So these episodes will be coming out monthly. We'll try to do it around the first of the month. And if you have questions in the meantime, you can look us up on our website, cornellmaple.com, and submit your questions.
Sounds great, Aaron. It's great to be back, and look forward to seeing you back in the studio soon for another episode of Sweet Talk, all things maple. Thank you for joining us for Sweet Talk, all things maple with Aaron and Adam. Sweet Talk is produced by the Cornell Maple Program and is made possible with funding from the New York State Maple Producers Association and the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service. All music is obtained from Blue Dot Sessions. For more information on all things maple, visit cornellmaple.com. Have a sweet day.